That's fantastic. I really love when we have a little bit of time. I see Hannah saying she took July, canceled, retaking November. Anybody taking September, just out of curiosity? Okay, we got Samantha taking September. Awesome. And then we've got someone else, Sean, taking November. All right, so we have a good mix here. Now, anyone who took July, I see Hannah already canceled. Is anyone, and I saw Sean took July and canceled as well. Madeline, did you cancel July? Are you keeping it? Are you unsure? Where are you at with that right now? Didn't cancel yet, but maybe you're thinking about it. So my general take on this is that there is never a reason to cancel your score unless you know for a fact that you did horribly wrong, embarrassingly wrong, not even close to what you would want a law school to see. For July, of course, it's unique in that we actually can see the score. So if you are going for a top 14 law school, but you got below a 160, that's probably not going to be a score that's going to put you in the running. No reason to keep that score. Alternatively, if you took the LSAT and you did pretty well or you feel pretty good about it, even if you think you could do better next time around, you probably want to keep the score because who knows what will happen going forward. Maybe you'll get a great score, maybe you'll get the same score, maybe you'll get a lower score, or maybe you'll be planning to take the LSAT in the future and then something comes up in life, your work, family, school, whatever it may be, that would actually lead you to not do your best studying for the following LSAT, or maybe it would lead you to take the LSAT and then simply not do well on it. And so there is some security in having a score on record, even if it's not your ideal score, as long as it's decently close to where you want to be, I would keep it. And so if you walk out of an exam and you feel vaguely uncertain about it, you're not really sure how it went, there's this one game that gave you trouble, this one passage that gave you trouble, one logical reasoning section that didn't go as well as you would have liked, but you can't point to anything concretely that went terribly wrong, like you misbubbled an entire section or skipped a whole game when normally you complete all 4 games. In those cases, I would say keep the score. Law schools do not average multiple scores. They only take the highest. I was recently hearing from someone in Canada who was saying, unlike the US, our schools take the highest. Well, turns out the US takes the highest also. There might be 1 or 2 law schools out there that consider multiple, maybe 1 in Canada, I think, that averages multiple, but all the others take the highest. That's because they have incentive to do so, given the American Bar Association reporting and given US News rankings. The ABA only requires schools to submit the highest scores of their matriculating applicants. And so that's what US News considers is only the highest score. So if you got a 160 and then a 170, it's like you got a 170, the 160 never happened. Same goes for as if you got a 170, then you retook and got a 160. Kind of strange, just how it is. The 170 would still be what counts. Now, obviously, it's better to have a single 170 than to have a 170 either preceded by or followed by a 160. And I know I worded that confusingly, just like the LSAT does. But basically, whether the 160 came before or after the 170 doesn't matter. 170 is what you've got. And obviously, you want to have a single score versus multiple, but real life happens. It is what it is. Just go ahead, apply with your top score, knowing that that's what law schools ultimately have incentive to care about. This also means that retaking is a great thing to do, and the LSAT is being offered more frequently than ever before. We have an LSAT being offered almost every month coming up for the foreseeable future. So that means that if you're taking the LSAT in 1 month, you might also want to take the LSAT 2 months from now or 3 months from now as well, because you've only got to stay fresh on the LSAT for another 4 to 6 weeks on average. That could be as little as doing 1 timed practice test per week over the course of the following 4 to 6 weeks, plus, of course, extremely detailed review of those exams. That alone could be enough to stay fresh, improve your understanding a little bit, and simply through luck alone, you might do 3 to 4 points better on your retake. There is a margin of error or a score band of 3.5 points on either end, meaning that if your true aptitude is, let's say, a 160, you might get a 160 one day, a 164 the following day, and a 157 the day after that. So 3 different test administrations could give you 3 very different results. But the nice thing is, law schools only truly calculate your chances, your admissions index, with the highest of those 3. And so if you got a 157 one day, you might be able to retake it and get a 164 if your true aptitude was a 160. So if you've got a few LSATs coming up, you might want to take multiple just to kind of spin the roulette wheel and see what happens. It is worth it. Now, when is too late to apply? Typically, the spring is later than I would like. Law schools have the most financial aid available, and your odds are slightly higher if you apply by the fall. So if you can, I would be done with it by the fall, move on from there, and submit your applications. Alternatively, if you're not ready until the spring, then I would suggest instead waiting until the following cycle to apply, unless there is some urgent reason why you need to go to law school as soon as possible. But for the vast majority of people, that is not the case. Now, if we're looking at how to study over a 1 to 3 month period, what do you want to be doing? It's not enough to simply be doing exam after exam and reviewing and measuring your results. There's a lot more that goes into it. If you already have a really strong foundation, that might be where your focus lies. But if you still have weak areas, or you're still towards the beginning stages of your prep, or you never really had a strong foundation to begin with, then I recommend a 5-step approach to LSAT mastery. I call this the LASER approach to LSAT studying. LASER is an acronym that stands for learning, accuracy, sections, exams, and review. Learning is working on the theory, reading textbooks, watching foundational videos, just learning the basics related to the different sections of the exam and the different question types. You want to do that first. Next, you work on accuracy, where you drill questions by type to solidify your understanding of the various question types. This could involve reading a chapter in a book, then doing problems of that type, or watching a video, instructional video on that question type, then doing several questions of that type, whether it's doing a bunch of ordering games in a row, a bunch of grouping games in a row, or a bunch of necessary assumption questions or flaw questions in a row. Next is S for sections, doing individual timed 35-minute sections to work on your pacing. This also helps you get accustomed to doing that grab bag of questions where you might have a grouping game, then an ordering game, then a combination game, then a curveball game, or you might have, of course, in the logical reasoning section, 25 questions that are the broad spread of a dozen plus different question types. So you have those bite-sized: necessary assumption, then flaw, then strengthen, then weaken, then must be true, then parallel. And so you have to get used to jumping from one thing to another. At first, it can feel a little bit like playing dodgeball, but over time, as you become proficient in the different question types, this becomes easier. So that's sections, individual timed 35-minute sections. Next is E for endurance and exams, doing full-length 5-section timed exams to build your LSAT stamina, because it's one thing to do a single section, it's one thing to do a dozen necessary assumption questions in a row, but it's something completely different to sit down for a full 3+ hours doing 3 sections back to back with no break at all, then a short break of 10 to 15 minutes, then 2 more sections back to back. That's a long day, and even my brain's fried after doing all that. And so I can't imagine how bad it is for you. I've been doing this for nearly 15 years now, and still, I don't want to do anything else that day that's mentally taxing at all. So it's worth doing several sittings like this to build your endurance. I would recommend ideally that you do 10 full-length timed exams, 10 3-hour sittings of 5 sections before test day. Now, of course, if your exam is only 1 month away, I wouldn't recommend trying to cram in all 10. I would recommend doing typically 1 a week, maybe 2 a week over the course of a 3 to 4 month period at most. Now, and then prior to that, working on your foundation. But if you've got 2 months, then 2 a week could be good. If you've got 3 months, then maybe 1 or 2 a week would be perfectly fine. And hopefully you've done at least 1 or 2 of those already. Now, again, it's really more about just going through the motions. So maybe 5 is enough for you. But really, I want you to focus not so much on just doing those exams, but finally the R for review. Review is the number one most important aspect of LSAT studying and the most often overlooked. It is not enough to simply take exam after exam, measure your results, track them on a spreadsheet, be happy or sad about how it turned out, and then move on. That is churning and burning, wasting material. It is far more useful to do fewer exams and review them in greater detail to see why you made the mistakes you made, what led you to choose the wrong answer in some cases. So specifically, let's say you were down to 2 choices and you say, oh, I always pick the wrong one. First off, you don't always pick the wrong one. You just notice the cases where you did pick the wrong one. The ones where you guessed and got lucky, it could have just as easily gone the other way the next time around. So you've got to review those questions as well. And specifically, you want to see whether your mistake stemmed from a misunderstanding of the stimulus, of the question stem, or of the answer choices. If it was the stimulus, you got to look at what was it about the method of reasoning that tripped you up that you did not fully understand. Was it the terminology? Was it abstract language? Was it conditional indicator words? Was it evidence conclusion indicator words? How did they go about making their argument? And what were you missing in terms of their method of reasoning? There are some complex, counterintuitive, unexpected methods of reasoning out there, and it's tough to puzzle through them under timed conditions on test day. The LSAT really is a test of pattern recognition, meaning that you want to, with any new question, automatically relate it back, even maybe subconsciously, to questions you've done before. And as the methods of reasoning get more complex, they show up less frequently, which means that you've actually got to do a really large variety of LSAT questions in order to see the same difficult methods of reasoning show up multiple times. What makes the LSAT easier for me than for someone like yourself is that I've done every exam out there multiple times. And so when I see a new question, I can automatically, subconsciously relate it back to something I've done previously. I'm not reinventing the wheel or interpreting that method of reasoning for the first time. And so analyzing those questions on a deeper level is really important to solidify your understanding of that particular concept, of that particular general principle or method of reasoning. Questions and misunderstandings are a little bit less common and they're easier to fix because, of course, question stems repeat a lot and there's only so much variation in question stem types. But LSAC does get tricky sometimes with unfamiliar wording in question stems, so you want to see if you misidentified a question type and did not fully understand what they were asking for. One of the most common areas this happens is with confusing necessary assumption questions for sufficient assumption questions. Those are very different question types, asking for very different things, and I can get more into the details on that later if you like, but this is, of course, something that's really important to know in order to approach the question from the proper perspective. Then, when it comes to evaluating the answer choices, this is typically where most students need to focus. You have tempting wrong answers and you have discouraging right answers. And I can imagine that LSAC, when they are constructing wrong answer choices, they are initially writing 5 correct choices, or at least 2 or 3 correct choices. Then they're tweaking a couple of those in order to make them wrong. They're switching one little word, tweaking it slightly. But as you know, a little bit wrong is actually all wrong when it comes to logic. And so you got to see what was that little tweak they made that answer choice wrong, so that, of course, you will be able to spot it the next time. Because there are tons of little tricks LSAC does like this, and you're not falling for all of those tricks, or else you'd be getting a 120, right? So you're getting a lot of questions right, you're avoiding a lot of the tricks. We've just got to figure out which specific tricks you are falling for, so that, of course, you can avoid making them again the next time around. So there's tempting wrong answers. Then there are also discouraging right answers where the wording is not ideal, it's not perfect, but it's the best of the worst, and it's technically correct. You see this most often in reading comprehension, where the main point or the primary purpose or the passage organization is not the way that you would have worded it if you wanted to be clear and concise and articulate things as simply as possible. But of course, that's not LSAC's goal. They're looking to essentially create legalese. And so you've got to pick the best of the worst. That's why process of elimination is so important and so useful, especially on LSAT reading comprehension. So again, this is the 5-step process: learning, accuracy, sections, exams, and review. The laser approach to LSAT studying. It's what all of my LSAT study plans are oriented around, whether you're using the day-by-day plan or using the one inside my courses where I relate them to the video lessons. That is the approach for each question type, for each section. And I recommend typically starting with logic games because they are the most unfamiliar at first. They are the lowest hanging fruit. Then we move on to logical reasoning while still staying fresh on games. Then finally add in reading comprehension while still cycling in games and logical reasoning. Now, I don't just say do a bunch of games. I suggest doing the easiest games first, then gradually moving on to the more difficult game types. So I'll say, let's start with ordering games, specifically the easiest of the easy ordering games, then moderate difficulty ordering games, then the toughest ordering games, then easy grouping, moderate grouping, difficult grouping, so on for logical reasoning, etc., going through the easiest logical reasoning types up to the more difficult ones. Now, that's the general approach. Once you've mastered a certain game type, once you've mastered game or section type, once you've mastered games in general, or at least gotten basic proficiency, then you start moving on to individual timed sections of games, not before. If you've never covered the basics of grouping games, why would you do timed sections of grouping games or sections in general? Because you don't know half the material. It's not going to go well, obviously. So you do the work untimed first, focus on the theory with learning, then the accuracy, then do the individual sections of that section type, whether it be games or reasoning or reading comprehension. Then finally, you do the full-length timed exams and you review them in depth. Now, if you're working or you're in school, doing one timed exam a week plus review could be enough. That could be all you have time for. Let's say that in an ideal world, you were scoring 170 plus. Let's say you got a 170 on your practice test. That means you got about 10 questions wrong. But there could have been another 10 that you had difficulty with, maybe you weren't sure of, but you guessed and got lucky. That is automatically 20 questions that you want to review. Now, if your review of an exam is taking only 1 hour, that means you spent on average 3 minutes for each of those 20 questions, which of course really is not enough. So we want to at least at minimum triple that. Let's say you did 20 questions and you spend 10 minutes per question. That's automatically giving you much more time. That's giving you well over 3 hours to invest in your LSAT review process per exam. So 3+ hours for the exam, 3+ hours for review. That becomes close to 7 hours. Plus, if you're reviewing any weak areas, that could easily boost up to 10 hours in one single week. But do you have 20 hours a week by adding on a second exam? You might not. It really depends, but I would suggest at minimum spending 10 minutes per question you get wrong or have difficulty with. One thing you could do as you're working through your exams is rate your confidence level on a scale of 1 to 10 in how confident you are on the choice that you picked. That way you will know if you guessed and got lucky, but you weren't totally certain. The only thing I would say is don't ever pick 7 because 7 is the cop-out answer on this. You want to say either you are confident or you're not confident, not too much in between there. So anyway, those are some general thoughts on studying and crafting your LSAT study schedule. I would say the other big thing I want to add though is take days off. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Too many students, especially those who are studying full-time or those who have few obligations, otherwise they run the risk of burnout. You don't want to put in 6, 7, 8 hours a day. Typically, I recommend a maximum of 5 to 6 hours in a single day. Maybe study from 9 to 12, take a break for lunch, another 2 or 3 hours. That's it. Just make it focused studying. Don't have your phone open. Don't have your email. Don't have your Facebook. Those are all distractions. And it's better to just get your studying done. than to kind of do a little bit of studying, a little bit of Facebooking, back and forth, back and forth. It really just drags out the process, and it's much nicer to just get your studying done for the day and be able to relax and socialize guilt-free. But carve out the time where you can. If you're working, before work, during lunch, after work, squeeze it in. If you're in school, treat it like at minimum a 6-credit class. And it's kind of funny because the LSAT is the most important factor in the admissions process, but typically students spend far less time on LSAT prep than they do on college. The LSAT is a single day, and college is over the course of 4 years, but the LSAT weighs more heavily. So you don't want to invest only 2 to 3 months in your LSAT prep process, and you don't want to only spend 5-10 hours a week on it. Ideally, you would spend closer to 15-20 hours a week. And so if you can, if you're in college, take a lighter course load during the semester so you can focus more on your studies. If you're working, maybe take a little bit of time off work, maybe lighten your workload a little bit. If you're a paralegal, do what you can to work fewer hours and not do the overtime. And if you're in school, take a lighter course load. But people really do underestimate just how long this takes. And so I'd say lengthen your timeline and minimize your other obligations. All right, if no questions, I will jump ahead and talk a bit about digital LSAT prep specifically. Now, as you know, the LSAT has gone digital. The big question I get is, do you need a tablet? The answer is no, you don't need to buy a tablet, but it would be worth practicing at least a little bit on a tablet. Maybe borrow one from a friend if you can, borrow one from a family member, buy one on Amazon and then return it if you decide that it's not for you post LSAT. The LSAC is using a Microsoft Surface Go 10-inch tablet, but that's pretty expensive. It's around $400. You don't need that tablet specifically. Any old tablet will do. So if you already have a Samsung or an iPad, or you can borrow one from someone else, use that. There's also the Amazon Fire HD 10-inch tablet, about $150. And like I said, Amazon has a good return policy, so you can always return it afterwards if it's not for you. It really is important to practice like it's game day. And LSAC has put a handful of free digital LSAT practice tests on their site at familiar.lsac.org. And so you can go on a tablet, go on that site, and play around with the digital LSAT features and functionalities just a little bit to see what it's like. And of course, I'd recommend saving those exams to do in the digital format. Don't do them on paper. Now, of course, there are only a handful of LSATs currently in the digital format. And so what do you do for the others? If you want more practice, I would say use the PDFs, have them on your computer screen or on your tablet screen, and then do your work on scratch paper on the side. On the digital LSAT, LSAC is giving you a booklet of scratch paper. It's that thin newsprint-like paper. And so you can't draw freehand on the tablet, but you can write on your scratch paper, and that's the best way to practice and treat your prep tests like a screen, like your computer screen, where you wouldn't be able to write or draw anything at all on there. So get used to using the scratch paper, and it's not unlimited, of course. It is one single booklet of about 12 to 14 pages, 8.5 by 11 paper, but I wouldn't stress too much about the space constraint. Now, what I want to add is that with your books, keep them clean. The benefit also is that you can redo problems very easily if you keep your prep test books clean, and you will also be simulating the digital LSAT in the same way there. Now, if you want to simulate being able to see only one question at a time, I recommend cutting out a hole in a piece of paper, a rectangle about the same size as one LSAT problem, and then placing that on top of your LSAT book so that you can limit your field of vision to only one question at a time. Because on the digital LSAT, which I'll show you shortly, you can only see one single logical reasoning question, one single games question, and one single reading comprehension question as well. Now, those tools, I actually don't recommend using them. I don't think they're that helpful. I think they're a little bit glitchy. You'll see if you play around with this on your own that it's not totally responsive, whether you are using a stylus or your finger. It is not that easy to use. It's kind of clunky, and so I recommend staying away from those tools. I would simply instead do all your work on your scratch paper, make all your notations on your scratch paper, and simply leave it at that. Don't rely on their tools. Now, like I said, You should get a tablet or at least practice with one. You don't need to buy one though, of course, for the long term. I would also get a stylus. You can get a stylus on Amazon for about $10. Any stylus would be fine, just to play around with what it'll be like on test day. Now, on test day, you will get a stylus that is a stylus on one end and a pen on the other end, which you can use for your scratch paper. Initially, LSAT was not going to allow pencils. Now they've changed course. They are allowing pencils as well to use with your scratch paper. Simply a matter of preference, whether you want to use pencil or pen for your scratch paper. Another change happening, of course, is that the writing sample has gone digital as well. You're no longer doing the writing sample at the test center. Instead, you're doing it later from the comfort of your own home or wherever you want to bring your laptop on your own time. It's still a 35-minute time constraint, and you're typing it on the computer. They're monitoring you with a webcam and a microphone for security purposes, making sure no one else is helping you, no one else is in the room, and there's nothing else assisting you. Now, what does this mean? It means that law schools may be slightly more likely to take the writing sample seriously because it's typed and more legible for them to read, and it's going to be easier for you to write because you're not writing by hand. It's easier for you to type, typically, unless you have accessibility issues. It's easy for you to edit your writing, and so you'll work through it faster, most likely. So I would say spend 20-25 minutes writing your writing sample, then another 10 to 15 editing your work, making it as polished as possible. You don't have to seriously study for the writing sample. I would, of course, focus more on the scored portions of the LSAT, significantly more so. But once you're done with the LSAT, you have up to 1 year to complete the writing sample. And so do it on a day when you're fresh, when you've maybe done a practice writing sample or two, you're familiar with what the sorts of things they're going to be asking you, and you're energetic enough to do the best work possible for yourself. Now, don't delay it too long though, because law schools will not get to see your score, meaning LSAC will not release your score to law schools until you've completed the writing sample. You can still get your score back, but it will not be submitted to law schools until you've completed at least one writing sample on record. If you've done a writing sample in the past, you don't need to do another one. But if you want to do another one, of course, you can. That is available to you. Once again, I've said a lot. Happy to take any questions you have on anything at all, digital LSAT prep, writing sample, and so on. I'm happy to address any and all questions that you have around this. Samantha's asking, since the actual LSAT prep tests contain only 4 sections, what should you add for your 5th section? Great question, Samantha. I would suggest rotating it. Get used to every possible iteration or permutation of what your LSAT could be like. So if your nightmare would be to have 3 logical reasoning sections, add in a logical reasoning section. If your nightmare is 2 reading comps or 2 games, or even worse, 2 games back to back or 3 logical reasonings back to back, simulate that as well. Like I said, ideally you want to do 10 full-length timed exams before test day. And so if you're doing that, you would have plenty of opportunity to do all different iterations of this. I'd say mix it up. Be ready for anything, especially what you would not like to see most. Do it now so that if it happens on test day, it will not be the first time that this has happened to you. Got a question on diagnostics. What should you do for a diagnostic? Actually, I don't love the idea of diagnostics. I think that diagnostics being done before you've done any studying at all is simply discouraging. Obviously, if you've never seen the LSAT before, or you've never built a strong foundation, your diagnostic is not going to go great. It's like taking a diagnostic in a foreign language you haven't ever learned yet. It's just simply going to tell you that you don't know the material, which you probably already know. So I would say, don't do a diagnostic if you can avoid it. And if you've already done one, just know that does not represent your potential, does not represent your aptitude. It's simply telling you you still have work to do, which you probably already know, because let's face it, the LSAT is extremely difficult. It's an exam where you could get only 90% of the questions correct and still be in the 97th percentile. 10 questions wrong equals a 170, which is a crazy curve if you think about it. So it's a really tough exam. It's not meant for most people to be able to complete it in the time allotted. And so they're asking a tremendous amount of you, which is why it takes more prep than you ever would have expected. It certainly was the case for me. I thought I'd knock this out in 2 to 3 months. It ended up taking me an entire year before I was able to go from a 152 initially to a 175 on test day. And that took doing every single exam ever released and every single prep book I could find. And of course, I'm not saying that you need to do that in order to achieve similar results. In fact, my goal with everything I offer is to ease the process of your self-study, make it easier for you to go down the same path that I did without making all of the same mistakes. And so doing fewer exams, reviewing them in more depth, really seeking to analyze and understand the exam from the test maker's perspective is extremely important. And so if you are looking to do a retake, if this is not your first go around with the LSAT, I really want to ask of you, think what you could do differently this time around. Even if you've done every single exam ever released, there is value in redoing prep tests because you want to spot the patterns in the mistakes that you're making. And think about it. If you've done the same exam multiple times and you did not get a 180 on your second or third attempt on that exam, that means there's plenty for you to learn there. If you've seen it before, if you've seen the right answer, why on earth would you get it wrong again? Obviously, this happens to everybody. Nothing strange about it. It means that you did not review it enough to solidify your understanding of the concepts that messed you up on your first or second go through on that exam. So I always laugh when people say I can't do the same exam again. Of course you can. There's always more to learn from exams. I still get value out of reviewing exams. And believe me, when I've done the same game 30, 40, 50 times with a student, I'm still seeing new things about that game, which also means that when you're seeing explanations out there created by myself or others, video or written, those are not realistic representations of what you need to be thinking in the moment as you complete a problem. That is somebody's perfect way of doing it after having seen that problem for the 10th or 20th or 50th time. And it's only also one way to do the problem. And so the real value in review is not looking at explanations. It is in reviewing things for yourself. And then only after that, maybe looking at an explanation or two to get a different take on it. But review, extremely important. Also, in terms of next leveling up your prep, I want you to think about how you might write your own LSAT problems, how you might write your own logic game, or even just a logic game drill, or maybe a tempting wrong answer for a logical reasoning question, or a discouraging additional right answer for a given logical reasoning or reading comprehension question. This is one of those techniques for those seeking top scores. Not everybody needs to do this, but it is really a useful exercise. I recently had a student write a couple of her own logic games. In the first game she wrote, she had 4 questions in the game. 2 of them were invalid, meaning there were multiple correct answers or no correct answer. And they were not thoroughly fleshed out. But the second game she wrote for me was perfect, no mistakes at all. And it was actually tougher than I expected. It took me more time than I would have thought. And so if any of you write your own games, please feel free to send them over. I would love to see what you do, and I'm happy to critique it for you. I have a lot of fun doing this. It's just something I really get a kick out of, because they are complex. It's tough, but not as tough as you would think. And funnily enough, there are plenty of books out there containing fake LSAT games with mistakes in them. And so as an exercise, once you've gotten fairly proficient in logic games, you might want to look at some of these books with fake LSAT questions and work through their games to have fun spotting the mistakes. For example, LSAT for Dummies, terrible book, has lots of errors in the answer key, lots of errors in the problems themselves. Could be a good thing if you're looking for extra practice material to work through and look for those games with those mistakes. I've personally written several games of my own. I have a book of 10 logic games that are unofficial. About a half dozen were written by myself. Another couple were written by students. And these games contain no mistakes at all. I guarantee you, I'm offering a $1,000 bounty if you spot any errors in logic in these games. They're that airtight. And I've been using them for years. And most of the ones that I wrote, at least, were tougher than actual LSAT logic games. So a great resource if you're looking for additional practice there and you want to see the exam from the test maker's perspective, because in my games, the difficult questions, I'm leading you down paths to kind of take advantage of fallacies you might make. And so there's nothing more devious than leading someone to confidently choose a wrong answer and walk away feeling good about it. The LSAT, on its most difficult questions, they do that as well. And so it's really useful to see how they're constructing these. So anyway, enough on that. Back to your questions. What else do you have for me? Got a question. What's the best way to proceed when you encounter a reading comprehension passage and you have no clue what it says, can't make heads or tails of it? Should you skip it or should you attempt it in the moment? I think if you're aiming for at least a 160, 165 plus, you're going to want to be doing all 4 passages, no question. So if you've already invested some time in reading the passage, you've got to slow down and see, can you walk away with simply what is the main point? What is the primary purpose of the passage? Why did the author write this? If you can't walk away with that, then honestly, you don't really know anything about it and you don't have a hope of getting anything correct. So slow down, find the main idea, find the primary purpose. Typically, there will be a key line or two where they summarize the main idea or the author expresses their opinion. So look for that key word or key phrase that tells you the author is expressing their opinion. Pick that up, then solve all the global, general oriented questions. Like main idea, primary purpose, passage organization, best title for the passage, best tone of the passage, author's opinion, things of that nature. Then next, do the detail-oriented questions with particular references to a certain point in the passage. Then do your more inferential questions that involve reading between the lines, or the ones that ask you, what would the author be most likely to agree with? So you're doing general, global questions, then local, then more inferential, or questions that are more analogous to logical reasoning questions. In games, though, it's the opposite. In games, you want to do orientation questions, which are the gimme questions at the beginning, then your local questions, then your global questions, because as you do local questions, you build up a bank of previous valid scenarios, of these hypotheticals that you can use to help you eliminate wrong answers in the global questions. Now, if you encounter a game and you're totally stumped, slow down, see if you can at least knock out the orientation question and use the orientation question to give you an idea of how you might diagram it, because it's telling you how LSAC is thinking about the game. Then your local questions help you, again, like I said, build up those previous valid scenarios and give you an immediate jumping off point. Then finally, you could do the tougher global ones and make use of all your previous work as well as the correct answer to the orientation question. And then, as for logical reasoning, those are, of course, bite-sized, grab bag, no groupings there. But you do know that you have a general order of difficulty in logical reasoning. So I would simply work through them in the order given. No, I would not do the hardest logical reasoning questions first. There's no reason to do the harder ones and then risk never getting to the easier ones. And there also is something to be said for the momentum of building confidence as you go, bubbling things in as you go, getting more correct as you move on, and then saving the toughest ones for last. Also, using that flagging feature on the digital LSAT, you can very easily skip questions to come back to later. You can flag as many as you want. I typically flag 3 or 4 questions in a logical reasoning section because I don't want to deal with them in the moment. I would rather skip them and come back to them at the end when I at least have the confidence of knowing I have completed the section, and I typically have a time bank of around 5 minutes. How do you get that time bank? You blast through the easy questions. You do not second guess yourself on those easy questions. When you encounter a difficult question like a parallel, a principal application, a question involving abstract language, If you don't want to deal with it in the moment, simply skip it, make it one of the questions you flag, and come back to it at the end. Like I said, there's also a general order of difficulty, not a perfect order of difficulty. And so it might be that the last couple of questions, the last 2 or 3 questions, might actually be easier than the ones around 18 to 22 or 15 to 22. I typically find that 24 to 26 are usually slightly easier. That's me personally. Your mileage may vary, but that's typically what I find. Now, as for the question of reading the question stem before the stimulus, what to do first? Yes, there are plenty of conflicting opinions out there, plenty of top scorers and authorities on both sides of this debate. Some say read stimulus first, others say read the question stem first. Personally, I read the question stem first. I find it gives me the proper perspective from which to view the stimulus because, for example, you don't need to be evaluating the gap or the flaw in a must-be-true question, especially if that must-be-true question is simply a fact set and there's not even any argument there. Alternatively, if it's a flaw question, look for the flaw, ID the flaw, very straightforward. So I like having LSAT tell me what to be looking for as I read the stimulus. But back when I was studying myself, I actually read the stimulus first, and that worked okay for me too. But I found over time, even when I thought I was reading the stimulus first, I was always sneaking a peek at the question stem, or I would read stimulus, question, back to stimulus again anyway, so why read it the first time? That's my approach, but try out both, see what works for you. You have enough time that you could do a half dozen sections one way, a half dozen sections the other way, and see what works better for you, what feels more comfortable, and what gets you higher accuracy in the end. Got a question, how much should I predict the answer in logical reasoning? So this comes to that idea of pre-phrasing. Should you look to predict? The answer is yes, you should when possible, but it also depends on the question type. For a flaw question, definitely try to pre-phrase the flaw, predict it, try to articulate the flaw for yourself before looking for a description of the flaw in the choices, because having an idea in mind will make it much easier to spot LSAC's articulation of it when you come across it. But alternatively, for a must-be-true question, there might be a variety of things that must be true, and you can't necessarily predict the exact thing they're looking for. Or there might be a variety of ways to strengthen or weaken an argument, and you could predict one way, but LSAC chooses to give you another way in the choices. So I wouldn't necessarily think that you need to pre-phrase or that your pre-phrase will always be correct, but at the same time, it's worth trying to when possible. Let's see, what other questions do you have for me? What's the order from easiest to most difficult with logic games? Are there any particular games you recommend doing for each type? What's the best way to review a game? Great questions, Madeline. So the order from easiest to most difficult, my understanding, the way I frame it is that it's ordering is the easiest, then grouping, then combinations, then the curveball games. Then within each of those, I'd say relative ordering, aka relative sequencing or pure sequencing, is the easiest. Then strict sequencing or basic ordering, basic sequencing. Then with grouping, you have grouping in and out, splitting and matching, then combinations, then curveballs. Obviously, there's a variety of different terminologies for this here, but I'd stick to simply saying ordering, grouping, combinations. As for particular specific games, there's a ton I could recommend. I have articles on my site categorizing games by type and by difficulty as well. And so check out my website for more on that. Go to the free stuff tab, then the data and categorization section. You'll find it there. Within logic games as well, you'll find it there too. As for the best way to review a game, I'd say redoing it. Do the same game multiple times to see if the inferences start to flow more naturally, and if you're able to better make use of previous work and making better use of your diagramming rather than brute forcing by going through every single choice and trying them out one by one. So redoing games is the best way to deepen your understanding of them. And then after that, of course, you can look at various written and video explanations. I have explanations for the vast majority of games ever released on my site, on my YouTube channel as well, if you want to see my walkthroughs of games. But again, it's only one person's perfect way of doing a game. There are a variety of ways, and I might do the same game different ways on different days. Some of it is simply arbitrary, whether you orient things horizontally or vertically, for example. It's really up to you, not necessarily a right or wrong way there, but I would redo, and that's why also keeping your scratch paper clean is keeping your booklet, your test book clean is really nice. Doing the work on scratch paper to the side makes it very easy to redo games and not have to make photocopies or print out the PDFs multiple times and such. Someone's asking, can you go back to that idea of necessary versus sufficient assumption questions? What's the difference? So in logical reasoning, necessary assumption questions are asking you for what needs to be the case in order for the argument to work. The correct choice, when negated, will destroy the argument, leaving no ambiguity at all. Sufficient assumption questions, on the other hand, are asking you for what new information, if true, will guarantee the argument 100%, leaving no ambiguity at all. You tell the difference between these types based on the key verb in the question stem or key phrase in the question stem. Necessary assumption questions will have words and phrases, again, that key verb, that is synonymous with necessity, verbs like depends upon, requires, and assumes. Sufficient assumption questions, on the other hand, will have words and phrases that are synonymous with sufficiency, like allows, enables, follows logically if assumed, and properly inferred if assumed. The if in those phrases is your sufficiency indicator. Now, for necessary assumption questions, the negation technique or denial test works. You could simply negate each choice, correct one when negated, destroys the argument. I think of these as being a very specific kind of must be true question because a person who is logically committed to the argument is committed to believing in all underlying necessary assumptions. For sufficient assumption questions, on the other hand, they are often a bit more formulaic. Diagramming is often useful, and so you want to look for if there are multiple conditionals in the stimulus where you might want to diagram, and you could actually, in a lot of cases, mathematically predict the correct answer and then simply look for it in the choices. On my site, I have an article called Sufficient Assumption Tips and Categorization, where I actually categorized all the sufficient assumption questions in 40 plus exams and put them in different groupings based on the underlying formal logic of those questions. But actually, in a lot of cases, sufficient assumptions will simply be a broader, more generalized version of the argument itself. So for example, if the argument was saying something silly like, my dog chased your cat, a sufficient assumption would be any dog will chase any cat if it encounters one. That general principle, broadly speaking, would apply to that specific example of this dog and that cat. It's broader, fits it like a glove, very closely, fits it pretty tightly, works well. So that's what to be aware of on that necessary versus sufficient assumptions. Very common misconception. I would say do a bunch of one type, then do a bunch of another type, and then mix them up and see if you can distinguish them on your own based on the key indicator words. And you really do not want to mistake one for the other, because a lot of times, for example, for a necessary assumption question, they will put as choice A a very tempting wrong answer of a sufficient assumption, and students will confidently pick it and move on, none the wiser. Very sneaky of LSAT, but they love to do that. So anyway, we are at about an hour, and I know that you all got plenty of other things you could be doing. So if no other questions, I do want to leave off here, but I'm also happy to stick around if you have follow-ups. But if not, I want to thank you all for coming and investing your time with me to learn more about the LSAT, study plans, and digital LSAT prep. Please keep in touch as you move forward. As you know, I'm a real person. I'm here for you, and I'm happy to help you however I can. So please do keep in touch, and we'll talk soon. Take care, all.